My name is Daniel. Growing up, I always felt like a stranger in my own home. I had an older brother named Adam. To everyone around us, he was perfect. My parents loved him more than anything in the world. If Adam achieved something, my parents celebrated like it was the greatest moment of their lives. But when I achieved something, it was usually ignored. I remember one moment very clearly. I was 10 years old, and my school had organized a writing competition. I spent hours working on my story. I wanted it to be perfect. A few weeks later, my teacher announced the winners. When she said my name for first place, I couldn't believe it. My heart was racing with excitement. I ran all the way home, holding the certificate tightly in my hands. I imagined my parents smiling proudly. I imagined them telling me how proud they were of me. But when I walked into the living room and showed my father the certificate, he barely looked at it. He glanced at it for a second and placed it on the table. Then he said something that I will never forget. "That's nice, but your brother's grades are still more important." Those words hit me harder than anything else. At that moment, I realized something painful. No matter what I did, it would never be enough. Years passed, but things never changed. My brother always received the best things. When he wanted a new phone, my parents bought it immediately. When he started college, my father even bought him a car. But when I once asked for a laptop for school, my father simply said, "We don't have that kind of money right now." I nodded quietly and walked away. But a few weeks later, I saw my brother holding a brand new expensive phone. That day, something changed inside me. I stopped expecting anything from my parents. Instead, I made a promise to myself. If I wanted a better life, I would have to build it on my own. When Adam went to university, my parents paid for everything. His tuition, his apartment, his EXP. But when I told my father that I also wanted to go to university, his answer was simple. "If you want to study, you will have to pay for it yourself." I didn't argue. I didn't complain. I just nodded and went back to my room. That night, I made the biggest decision of my life. I decided to leave home. I packed a small bag with a few clothes and the little money I had saved. Leaving home was terrifying. I had no real plan. I didn't know what the future would look like. But one thing was clear in my mind. If I stayed in that house, I would always feel like I didn't matter. So I left. The first few years were the hardest years of my life. I worked small jobs just to survive. Sometimes I worked during the day and studied at night. There were nights when I was so exhausted that I fell asleep the moment my head touched the pillow. There were also days when I wondered if I had made a mistake. But every time those thoughts appeared, I reminded myself why I left. I wanted to prove something. Not just to my parents, but to myself. I wanted to show that I could build something meaningful, even if no one believed in me. And slowly, things started to change. Life didn't magically become easier after I left home. In fact, the first few years were brutal. I moved into a tiny apartment that barely had enough space for a bed and a small table. The walls were thin, and the heating barely worked during winter. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was responsible for my own future. During the day, I worked at a small grocery store stacking shelves and helping customers. The pay was terrible, but it was enough to cover rent and basic food. At night, I studied. There were nights when I felt completely exhausted. Nights when my eyes burned from staring at books for too long. Sometimes I wondered if my parents ever thought about me. Sometimes I wondered if they even noticed that I was gone. But I pushed those thoughts away. Because deep inside, I knew something important. If I wanted my life to change, I had to keep moving forward. Years slowly passed. The small jobs slowly turned into better opportunities. I worked in offices, warehouses, small companies, anywhere that would give me a chance. Every job taught me something new. How businesses work. How people make decisions. How money moves. And slowly, an idea started forming in my mind. I wanted to start my own business. At first, the idea felt impossible. I had no rich parents helping me. No one giving me money. No safety net. But I remembered something important. No one had ever believed in me before. So why should I wait for someone to start now? I saved every dollar I could. For years, I lived a very simple life. No expensive clothes. No fancy restaurants. Just work, saving money, and learning everything I could. Finally, after years of preparation, I took the biggest risk of my life. I started a small online business. At the beginning, it was incredibly slow. Some days I didn't get a single customer. Other days I wondered if everything would collapse before it even began. But I refused to give up. Day after day, I kept improving the business. I learned marketing. I learned customer service. I learned how to solve problems. Slowly, the business started growing. First I had a few customers. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Before I realized it, the small business I started from my tiny apartment had turned into something real. I hired my first employee. Then another. Eventually, I moved the company into a real office building. Standing in that office for the first time felt unreal. I looked around at the people working there and thought about how far I had come. From a kid who felt invisible in his own family, to someone who had built something from nothing. 10 years had passed since I left home. 10 years of struggle. 10 years of learning. 10 years of proving to myself that I was stronger than anyone believed. One afternoon, I was sitting in my office reviewing some reports when my assistant knocked on the door. "Daniel," she said carefully, "there are 2 people here asking to see you." I looked up from my desk. "Did they say who they are?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "They say they're your parents." For a moment, everything around me went silent. I hadn't seen them in 10 years. 10 years of silence. 10 years without a single call. And now, they were standing outside my office. I took a slow breath. "Send them in," I said quietly. A few seconds later, the door slowly opened. And for the first time in a decade, I saw my parents again. My parents stepped into my office, their faces filled with worry, confusion, and something else, regret. It was strange to see them after so many years. They looked older, tired, and fragile. Their pride had vanished, replaced by desperation. My father's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. "Daniel, we need your help. Adam's business, it's completely failed. We don't know what to do." For a moment, I just stared at them. These were the same people who had ignored me my entire childhood. The same people who had made me feel invisible. The same people who had told me to figure out my life on my own, without support. And now, here they were, asking for my help. I felt a storm of emotions inside me. Anger. Sadness. But also, a strange sense of calm. I had waited for this moment, not to hurt them, but to finally face them from a place of strength. I stood up and looked at them directly. "You want my help?" I asked quietly, my voice steady. They nodded, silently, without words. I gestured for them to follow me. As we walked through my office, I showed them everything. The staff working hard. The clients on calls. The success I had built from nothing. Their eyes widened with disbelief. They hadn't imagined I could do this. They reached the conference room, where I kept the most important files. I opened the cabinet and showed them the company documents, contracts, and accounts. "You see this?" I said. "I built all of this. From scratch. Without anyone's help. Without anyone believing in me." My mother's lips trembled. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Tears formed in her eyes. My father swallowed hard. We didn't realize, we never thought, you were capable of all this," he said softly. I took a deep breath. "You know, all those years. I could have hated you. I could have resented you. But I didn't. I worked hard. I stayed focused. And I became strong. Not because of you, but in spite of you." Their faces turned pale. The guilt was written all over them. I paused, letting the words sink in. "Today," I continued, "I will help Adam and the family, because I am family. But I want you to understand one thing." I looked at them, straight in the eyes. Never underestimate your children. Never take them for granted. Never make them feel invisible. Because one day, they might just become someone you can't even recognize. And by then, it could be too late. Tears were streaming down my mother's face now. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in that moment. They reached out, but I didn't move to hug them. I simply nodded. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. This was about proving my worth. I had waited patiently. I had worked tirelessly. I had built my life from nothing. And now, they were seeing the man I had become. Over the next few weeks, I helped stabilize Adam's business. Slowly, everything began to recover. But the most important change wasn't the money or the business. It was the respect. For the first time in my life, my parents saw me as an equal. They no longer treated me as the invisible child. And I realized that is the greatest victory of all. Because revenge might hurt someone, but success makes people respect you forever. I had left home as a boy who was ignored, underestimated, and overlooked. I returned as a man who could not be ignored, underestimated, or overlooked ever again. And that was my ultimate revenge.